Number 1. Freezing fog. Have you ever experienced ice fog or freezing fog before? It's a lot different than regular fog, which is also pretty rare. It has to be very, very cold and very, very humid outside for it to occur. But when it does, it is usually a lot thicker and harder to see through than regular fog is. Freezing fog is not as bad as ice fog, since it remains liquid and doesn't completely freeze, but it can still be very difficult to navigate through if you just happen to be walking out in it. When this story happened, it wasn't as easy to get weather forecasts as it is now. Although the temperature didn't fluctuate as much as it seems to nowadays, it still would occasionally. So it wasn't unheard of to get caught in bad weather simply because you hadn't been informed. I was a teenager when the story happened. I was over at my cousin's house and we were playing Nintendo games all day and well into the night. Before I knew it, it was pretty late, and I knew that I had to get home. We lived in the country more or less. We lived in old family homes that had been passed down from generation to generation, which is pretty common in my country. That's just like cold weather is very common in my country too. Normally though, if I was over at my cousin's house, I would ride my bike home after we got done. On this night, however, I didn't feel safe riding my bike. It was when I went out the door and saw the thick, freezing fog that I didn't feel safe riding my bike in that. So I decided it made more sense to walk my bike home. It was pretty unlikely that I would come across a car out on that old road, but if an animal were to come out in front of me, I could hit it with my bike and then risk a serious injury to myself. So I left to walk home to my own house. It had to be past midnight if I recall correctly. We didn't live in an area that was thick with trees or anything like that. It would be what you would probably refer to as a moorland. It was a hilly area that didn't have a whole lot of vegetation other than grass and the occasional shrub. There were also very few houses about anywhere. You could look out across the entire moorland during the daytime and likely not see any homes. So basically, it was a very barren and quiet area. There wasn't a whole lot that I could see as I was walking. The moon wasn't particularly bright that night as far as I could tell, so I could only see so much as I was walking around, which was completely different than normal. I had never been nervous walking home before in the dark, but there was just something about that fog and that night. I'm not sure if it was the sounds or lack of sound in the air, the lack of visuals, or maybe some sense beyond those themselves, but something just didn't feel very good. I'd walked before when my bike was broken, but I wasn't really sure how long it took me to do it. I was so used to riding my bicycle all the time. But this night, everything seemed like it was happening at a snail's pace. The atmosphere was so weird. It was quiet, dark, and very cold outside. I could almost feel the fog on me, and I began wondering how cold it would have to get to turn into ice crystals. I'd experienced it before, and it would have made the walk even harder. I was walking along on the side of the road, which had iced up pretty badly too. It was another good reason to not have been riding my bicycle that night. In the darkness and quiet, there was suddenly a sound. It was coming from in front of me, but because it was so quiet outside, I couldn't tell how far away it was. I didn't have other sounds to compare it to. The sound was definitely of somebody else walking on the road too. The sound was like tip-tap, 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 tip-tap. Normally, if I had seen someone walking down the road, I wouldn't give it much thought. Even late at night, I would give them a wave once I saw them. But I don't know if it was simply because of the atmosphere or something else, but I just felt strange about it that night. I had no reason to feel fear or apprehension, but I began feeling it. I was able to hear the tipping and tapping getting louder and louder as the other walker and I began approaching each other. I felt myself getting more and more nervous, probably because I couldn't see anyone yet. I squinted often into the dark to try and see if I could make someone out coming towards me. However, at no point yet had I been able to see anything. And then the strangest thing happened. I'd been hearing the tipping and tapping for quite a while at that point, and suddenly it stopped. I thought at first that whoever had been walking toward me must have just stopped for a moment. Still, as I walked forward, I didn't come across anyone, and I didn't hear the walking noises start up once again. Honestly, I was just confused and kept thinking that I was about to come across someone. I tried to forget about it and just keep on my way. I just wanted to get home as quickly as possible. I wanted to get out of the creepy atmosphere and then get back into my bed. The night had just been way too weird. I'm not sure how much time had passed without me hearing anything. It really was dead quiet outside. I almost began wishing that I could hear the tipping and the tapping of the walking come back. It seemed like just shortly after I thought that, I actually heard a tapping, walking sound on the road right behind me. Before I had a chance to react, I felt something touch my shoulder. I jumped at first, almost dropping my bicycle on the ground. However, I was able to turn around and see something I hadn't expected. I saw a human arm extended toward me in the fog. However, the fog was so thick, that was all that I could see. Whoever the arm belonged to, he was completely enveloped in the fog. I didn't have much time to think, I only had time to react, and so I did something I hadn't expected to do. I immediately jumped on my bicycle. Even though I had almost no visibility and the road was slippery, I didn't care. I just began riding the bicycle as fast as I could, booking it to get home. I didn't wait for anything. I didn't look back, not even once. I just kept riding hard until I got all the way home. When I got home, I dropped my bicycle at the door and got inside. I locked the door and ran up to my room, locking that door too. It wasn't until that I was in my bed that I had a few moments to put everything together in my mind. Whoever had been walking toward me on the road had obviously gotten off the road at some point. They kept out of sight distance, came up from behind, and tried to grab me from behind. I could only assume that his intentions were not good, or why would he have snuck around me like that? I didn't know who it was or what it was all about, but I often see that arm in my dreams, trying to grab me out from the dark fog. Number 2. Snowing. I was always left with a lot of responsibility when I was a kid. I was the oldest of 4 children, and even from a really young age, I had to be responsible for all of my siblings. I was babysitting them when I was young enough to need a babysitter myself. However, my parents always insisted that I knew better, and that I had to be responsible for all the other children when they basically didn't want to be. We lived in an old house out in the hills for my entire childhood. We had 1 car, which we had for years and years that I remember. It was old and probably not the best vehicle to be driving around in bad weather. If my parents were out, they wouldn't always come home if the weather was too bad, so it wasn't unusual that I would be home alone with the other kids overnight, sometimes even. This happened one winter when I was about 12 years old. My parents had gone over to some relative's house to hang out, drink, and do that sort of thing. I can't recall who it was, but that doesn't matter. This was the sort of thing that adults in my family did every weekend before driving home, likely drunk. I was at home with the other kids and I had to prepare dinner for them and keep them entertained. Luckily, it was a Friday night, so I didn't have to worry about getting them into bed too early. The kids all liked staying up late on a Friday night and watching Johnny Carson before bedtime. My parents weren't home when the school bus dropped us off. There was a note on the fridge to contact the Meeks family down the street if anything were to come up. They were a bit of a way up the hill from us, though, so we didn't ever contact them for any reason. As I mentioned before, I was supposed to know better, and thus be able to take care of all the others no matter what. And it began snowing not long after we got home. It seemed light at first, and like it might not stick, but I was sure wrong about that. The snow began falling pretty heavily, and it definitely was sticking, and began to pile up pretty quickly. It wasn't long until I got a call from the parents, letting us know that they would be staying the night over at their relative's house. They were drinking too much, and it would be even more dangerous than usual to drive up. No big deal. I had been expecting this to happen anyway. I put the 2 younger children to bed after Johnny Carson, and let my 10-year-old brother stay up with me. I didn't want to be up by myself, and he and I always got along pretty well. And I don't know if this is just in retrospect, due to what happened that night, but I recall feeling really creepy for some reason, and it was easier to have someone up with me. I kept on getting up and checking the weather. The front window looked out onto the yard, but it was hard to see much looking out there. We had a light on the front porch, which we always had to leave on when we were home alone, but the snow was so thick that we couldn't see very far out there. The snow was way too thick. It was pretty late and my brother and I were up later than we usually would have tried to stay awake. There were some Christmas specials on TV, and although the reception on the TV wasn't so good, it wasn't something that we noticed back then. All TV far out in the country got really fuzzy reception. Suddenly, out of nowhere, we heard a loud crashing noise. The couch we were sitting on was up against the same wall as the window, so we had to turn around in order to see that the window had been busted open. But the scariest part that we noticed, that there was an arm coming through the broken open window. That terrified us both, and we jumped up off the couch. My little brother jumped up and ran out of the room faster than I could have ever imagined. I couldn't blame him, though. I was 12 years old and terrified, so I could imagine how scared a 10-year-old could be. But he was also much faster than I was at getting out of the room as quickly as possible. I got up off the couch, looking back at the window and wondering what it was that I could do. I saw a guy that I didn't recognize, looking in the window. He saw me standing there and looked surprised to see me. And looking back, I think that maybe he thought no one was home, because of there being no vehicle in the driveway. It didn't make sense that he would be trying to rob a house in the middle of nowhere, though. At least it didn't make sense to me at the time. If he were a robber, I guess it's possible that he knew it would take much longer for the police to arrive. My little brother immediately ran back in the room with my dad's rifle, surprising me because I thought he wasn't going to come back. We were all taught to shoot at a very young age, so I guess I could understand why he went after the gun, but I thought he would be hiding under the bed or in the closet. The guy standing in the window saw the gun and immediately retreated backward. I ran over to the door and locked it. Although it was hard to see what was happening due to the heavy falling snow, I could at first see the man retreating into it. But it only took a few moments before he was completely lost in the torrent of the falling snow. We did our best to cover up the window, but we were mostly worried about whether the man was going to come back or go to another entrance. My brother and I went around to make sure that the doors and windows were all locked. Then we sat together on the couch, in fear of the guy coming back. We kept the rifle right by us, and we eventually both fell asleep on the couch. The guy never came back. The following morning, the snow was higher than I'd ever seen it before. There was no way our parents would be able to get back that day, and in fact, it took a couple days before they were able to. Fortunately, we didn't have any problems during that time. Number 3. Walk. My mom was kind of a witch when I was growing up, although I didn't realize it at the time. She really expected me to do a lot of things that you probably shouldn't have a younger kid do. This is the story of something that happened one of the times she made me do this. We lived in a holler during this time period. It was a few miles away from her mother's trailer, which was the next house down the road. We didn't have a car, so whenever we went to see Grandma, we had to walk there. Grandma had a car, and she would take us into town whenever we needed to do it. This happened on a really cold and snowy winter night when I was 10 years old. My mom was making something for dinner, and she needed to have cornmeal to make cornbread. Our stepfather was a real asshole, and he insisted on having cornbread with every meal. If he didn't get what he wanted, he could get very violent. So even though it was late, dark, and cold, my mom sent me over to my grandma's house to get some cornmeal. I got bundled up as best I could. We were poor, so we didn't have much, and then I went out into the cold and snow in order to go and get some cornmeal. It was the coldest I'd ever remembered it being in that area. I had never felt anything like it before. My poor clothing was hardly any sort of protection against those elements. It was snowing hard, and it was hard to walk out in the snow. I was having a much more difficult time than usual trying to make the walk. It was the hardest walk I ever had to take, and I knew it was going to take forever. Because of this, I kept getting colder and colder and colder. It wasn't very long before I actually began to get a little lightheaded too. I thought maybe it was too cold to be out in that weather, and thought about turning back. However, if I did, the wrath of my stepfather would be a whole lot worse than the cold, I told myself. So I kept trudging on through the snow. I kept feeling weaker and weaker, but I kept trying to make it to my grandma's house, where I knew that I would be safe. However, the further I went, the less it seemed like I was going to do it. At some point, my memory went blank. I recall walking in the cold, but it seemed like everything just went dark at some point. I don't remember what point that was. The next thing I knew, I was in the hospital. I was much warmer than I was before, but I didn't immediately remember even being out in the snow. It took me a while, I guess, to remember much of anything. However, I guess I'd passed out in the snow and fell on the side of the road. If it hadn't been for a car driving down the road noticing me, even though I had been covered in a bit of snow by that point, I probably would have died out there in the snow. Fortunately, someone much kinder than my mom and my stepfather noticed me and stopped the car and took me to the hospital. I recovered fully, but was treated like crap by my stepdad for quite a while, for being too much of a wimp to be able to make it to Grandma's house. He used to mock me for it all the time. Happy ending, however. The asshole accidentally killed himself while working on a car. I won't go into too much detail about that, but I think I gave you a good idea of what kind of man he was, so no one really missed him at that point. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.